Hi, Misha here, and this is another type of vacation video. I was cleaning some stuff up and had to dump out the box that I keep bayonets in, so my AK bayonets were out. So I lined some up and thought we would just, chat about them, who made them, some of the variants. If I went into all the variants, first off, I don't know all the variants, not even close. But even then, this would be a multi-part series. I don't think any of us want that. You can look it up online. There are literally entire books and websites dedicated. But we can talk about some of the, variants and the four basic types, give or take, and transitionals and yada, yada, yada. Yeah, why not? They're out. They were available. So, we'll get into it. We'll talk about the original AK47. I tend to think of these as Type 1. Then we move into the AKM styles. Sometimes these are known as Type 2 and 3, or sometimes AKM Type 1, Type 2. Take your pick. That transitions over into the AK74, which I tend to think of as Type 4, but others might just call AK74 or Type 3. Pretty much all of these are on a gradient, with the Type 1 really being where things are different. So let's talk about features and get in from that. Also, Hobo insisted that I let her out here before I began recording, so you'll probably hear meowing and or purring, and she may or may not jump up while I'm doing this. It'll be exciting for all of us. When Kalashnikov's rifle was first adopted, Russia had a bit of an inkling of what an assault rifle was, but still treated it much like a submachine gun. Other nations, for example East Germany and Poland, would simply designate it as a submachine gun in the beginning. Later, the classification would be made for it as a carbine. But my point is, they didn't think it would need a bayonet. No, the SKS would have a bayonet. Sure, originally a spike, soon a blade. But for a 16-inch barrel gun, it just wasn't felt as necessary. That's why the bayonet that goes on here might seem a bit of an afterthought. Because frankly, it was. They went to this mounting system up here. Actually, after the initial guns were produced, around 1950-51, the 1940 bayonet from the SVT 40 Tokarev rifle was the starting point. They would adapt it and to fit the AK. Here we have a more or less standard one. Notice the kind of flange on the scabbard. This is partial leather, partial canvas with a closure. The bayonet itself is very much just a stiletto type with a fuller and the edge on top. Most have synthetic grips. Some would have wood. And of course, the way these fit is unique to the original AK here. Might get it on this one. There we go. It kind of loops around the gas block to give it a little more support and guidance, locking onto these ears. It does stick out a ways. It was better than nothing, using an existing pattern they had, but definitely wasn't something originally in the design, and there were some downsides to it. For one, this mount wasn't as durable as it could be, and obviously on this one it's quite stiff. I don't know why this bayonet's so stiff. There we go. And it's not really comfortable to use, especially because of these rear here, but it's just grabbing it and everything in the hand. It's pretty much exclusively a bayonet. yeah, it's interesting, it's neat, but there was room for improvement. The AK47 Type 1 bayonet was made by several nations. This one here is from Poland. They're really hard to tell the bayonets apart. The grips can change in color, but even then it's hard to know when and where exactly. East Germany would also make some. North Korea. Some say Romania. Others say no. The Polish here is quite interesting. The scabbard is unique. It doesn't have the flange on the end because this is an extruded metal. Little different construction. Also, it has a full leather hanger. And unlike on the Russian pattern, this is actually removable, replaceable. Those are stitched on. I brought my Chinese 56-2 out because this one actually takes the AK47 bayonet. Other Chinese guns would take the Akm, the later variants. I should try it on. This may not fit. I was trying to be clever, but I guess this one's not going to fit for some reason. Goes to show you tolerances. The thing was that China didn't directly copy. Anyway, this has the lugs. You get the idea. So some of the Chinese guns would continue using the Type 1. Others would use the later style. I find the Polish one's kind of interesting. And if anything, they made some improvements to the design. And of course, most later Chinese military guns have that underfolding spike bayonet anyway. I don't know, just thought I'd bring it out. Of course, it's going to do that to me. Actually, not sure why that's not fitting, but I'm sure it's a tolerance issue somewhere along the way. I think the gas block is too thick. Yeah, there's a bit of a step here, more than on the other. I think that's what's knocking it. Oh well. Points made, I hope, at least. So let's move on to the AKM era. Well, they were caught unawares with the AK-47 about needing a bayonet, but they wouldn't repeat the same mistake twice. From the beginning, the AKM, adopted in 1959, had a dedicated bayonet lug under the gas block. And a dedicated bayonet was adopted for it. This is a Romanian variant, so it's a little bit different, but it illustrates the point. We had a whole new blade. It's shorter with a clipped point, kind of a hook point to it. Edge is still on the top, serrated edge on the bottom. This blade is treated as rust prevention. We have a new all one-piece synthetic grip, kind of bulbous on the end. The Russian style is a little different back here, but similar idea. It's supposed to be one piece. And we've added this strip of, it can either be leather or canvas. That's to retain it in the hand better as a fighting implement or just a tool. Not a hammer though, incidentally. But to make it more of a utility knife. We also have the cutout in the blade here to interact with our scabbard to be a wire cutter. This is a pretty common feature today, but it was pretty ahead of its time back in the early 60s. The scabbard is steel. It does have this rubber insulator on it. Yeah, I know mine's starting to get old and rip. Oh well, on this one. And the original Russian had more of a small leather belt hanger that clipped on, so easy removable and replaceable. Romania, and this is Romanian bayonet, went to this larger all leather thing, which, you know, a little nicer, frankly. So it's a totally reworked system. And this is not only a bayonet now, but can serve many purposes. Easier to install, it's a much more secure mount, and mine always comes off there. This one always on hooks, but it goes to show you this does just kind of hook on up here. A little strap. It's kind of just come on. There we go. So you can always just unhook it and just unthread it here if you need to get rid of it. But this was what I consider the Type 2 bayonet, but if you want to separate the AK47 and AKM, this is the Type 1 AKM bayonet. Single piece synthetic grip with the steel scabbard and the insulator there. And of course this is just a Wasser tin. Seemed appropriate considering it's a Romanian bayonet. And this would be a very common bayonet, produced of course in Russia. It would be made in Poland, Hungary. It would be made in Romania, of course, and several other nations besides. It was, pretty popular for a bit. I think Bulgaria also made it for a little while too. But it wouldn't last long. And actually, already by 1965, it would begin to get replaced. Starting around 1965, we do get into the AK Type 2, or the overall Type 3 bayonet. But of course, nothing can be straightforward and simple, so there was a transitional period. And probably the most common transition would be using the original steel scabbard with the new bayonet. And the major update was to the grip. They went to a metal steel pommel here, end piece, because it was wearing out. People were banging as a hammer and generally speaking beating it up, and they were cracking. So they modified the grip, and so this is a transitional Type 2 bayonet with a Type 1-ish scabbard. And I brought out the Psl to show you that Romania was one of the nations that did manufacture and issue this style. Another would be Egypt. And they would not just be on the AKs. They would, if I can get this one to go on, there we go. They would fit other weapons too, like the Psl here. Kind of interesting. A Psl bayonet is the same. Well, this one's not quite all the way on, but that's okay. I think it's hanging up on the muzzle brake a wee bit. You can tell I just did this on vacation for fun. It's about how it goes for me sometimes. There we go. Now it's all the way on. But they did put the serial number from the Psl on the bayonet, so they are identifiable. This one doesn't match, but it gives you the point. And they would have started issuing these about the time the Psl was coming about. So that's kind of neat, I thought. I've got another transitional to show you here. Poland had a kind of unique flavor. Just as they had modified the AK47 bayonet to suit their needs, they also modified the AKM, namely getting rid of the sawtooth edge. And the grips would be kind of brown to black, typically the same kind of material as they would use on their pistol grips, especially early on. That's why I brought out my early KBK AKM, introduced in 1966. So they would do this with the AKM Type 1 as well as the transitional. So you'll find these without the serrations for many, many years. There we go. Kind of a uniquely Polish thing. Sorry, this one's missing the hanger. On the other hand, the insulator is in good shape on this one, so I haven't ever really set out to collect bayonets. These are just ones that have come with guns that I've acquired over the years. Yeah. So, what about the full Akm Type 2 or Type 3? The full Akm Type 2 or Type 3 was in service by the 1970s and has the same type of bayonet we were talking about with the metal end. This one has a canvas strap, some will have leather. The difference here is with the scabbard. Because of the use of the AG4 material, bakelite as we call it, they were able to start making scabbards from it. It's all basically one piece with the seam. Of course, it's metal here where this hooks, and the end piece for the wire cutter's metal. And this is a Russian one, so it has their kind of pebble grain material here with the button. You can see the ish-esque triangle. And these would have been on later AKMs and the first AK74s. Again, standard lug here. This is actually one of the few bayonets that actually I know came with this gun. This is the Legion gun, and this is the bayonet it came with. So these are a set together. And this was very widely produced. Russia, Hungary, China, Bulgaria. I'll probably put a list in the description. There was also a transitional in reverse where you had the Type 2 scabbard and the Type 1 bayonet. That's probably just using up old stock or whatever they had. You see these from Russia, and there was one other country, I believe it was East Germany. Could be wrong on that. Again, very informal video. But there is the reverse transition as well. But by this point, we've got an all synthetic group. And notice the rubber insulator is gone because this is a non-conductive material. The whole scabbard is insulated, at least until you get to this point. So keep your hand back at least. But yeah, these were very widely produced, so I've got a few different flavors of this style. The main AK bayonet produced by Yugoslavia for use on its M70s was the Akm Type 2. Pretty well standard. It had black plastic, black bakelite, kind of shiny. Actually very similar to East German. And this is where me being me can be a little frustrating because I'm not 100% sure this is Yugo. Seems to be based on touching it. What I can tell you, it definitely has Yugoslavian Cosmo line on it. So, yep, definitely Yugo. It has that unique smell. So if it's not originally made by Zastava, it certainly spent time there. But either way, black, shiny, Type 2 would be Jugo. And I believe this even came with the Yugo gun. There we go. Actually fits this OPAP very tight, which is a good thing. And this would also be found on their DMR, the M76. And be used on many of their other variants. Like I said, these were carried over for later AKMs, later 7.62s, and would be the first types used on the 5.45x39 guns. Here's another variant. Leather hanger, bakelite, grips and scabbard, kind of that brownish red color. And my best, just bog standard AK74 representative is definitely this SLR 105. And this would have been a type of bayonet issued with it. Bulgaria definitely did make the Type 2 AKM. Click. And you'll notice this mounts under the front sight base, so it makes room for the muzzle brake. This also has the benefit of sticking it out a little further, getting a little more length. Now, since this is an import, the rear lug here is not existent, but this was kept on military guns as a so-called accessory lug. Not often utilized. Sometimes it would be used for an underbarrel grenade launcher. Not frequently, but yeah, the front lug was for your bayonet. And it's actually part of the front sight base, which is why this gun has it. And just goes to show you, yeah, this was the original AK74 bayonet used. I always thought that was a neat look with the brake and everything. Back during the assault weapons ban, when we could only dream of such cool features as bayonet lugs and threaded barrels. Keeping the SLR 105, the AK74 on the table, with the SAR2, the PA86, because I want to show you something. Romania continued to make the bayonets, going over to full Type 2, but there is one difference. For one, we have the Romanian belt hanger, the full size. Later ones will be a canvas leather hybrid, but also we've added bumps here and here in addition to the hanger, because some Romanians did use the Russian style simple hanger, but they did modify the scabbard ever so slightly to use their hanger. The bayonet was pretty straightforward. This one's missing its grip strap, but that's okay. Pretty standard. What I wanted to show you, and I'm sure most of you know, for one thing, this is threaded 24 millimeter. This is 22. But notice that the lug is at the very rear of the base, and this lug, the base doesn't go back near as far. It's different positioning. That's because this is a shorter, fatter muzzle brake. This is a longer, skinnier brake. Kind of interesting. Not 100% sure why Romania did that, but it does mean the bayonet mounts ever so slightly different. It actually protrudes just a little bit further than it would have on a standard 74. So it's kind of a neat variation there, I thought. Again, things we can only dream of back in the day. And of course, color would shift from nearly black to brown to red, even sometimes to orange. And this one did come out, including with the hanger from an old Wasser, so presumably it's all Romanian. If not, oh well. But I thought the canvas was kind of neat. Before we move on to our final category, brought the Polish non-serrated back out, and the Tantal, because this was the basic type, either with the Type 1 or 2 scabbard in use. I think most of them were the Type 1s, come to think of it, with the AKM and the Tantal, and it even carried over use to the Baril. If you have a Baril, you'll notice there's the rear lug here, then the bipod mount, and then the front lug. And then you have this very long muzzle device on the Tantal. On the Baril, positioning is a little different. But that's to mount the standard bayonet as usual. So even though this is a very different kind of barrel profile, barrel arrangement, it really goes to show you how they standardized by this point, even with this gun being adopted in 1988 and actually not really seeing full service until the 90s. Yeah, for whatever reason, Poland did not like the serrations. And actually, they didn't really replace this pattern of bayonet until the 21st century. And speaking of the 21st century, let's talk about our most modern category. The Type 4 bayonet. Really the modern style. I've seen this referred to as the AK74 bayonet. I would disagree with that, because for the majority of the AK-74's production, at least in Russia, bayonets like these were used with it. This is more of the AK74M/AK Century series, AK100 series bayonet. And at first it made us look like we're using black polymer. After all, the Scabbard is very similar. Just instead of being made from brown, red, or trending towards black, this is made of a matte, pure black texture. But actually, the bayonet itself is radically different at the blade. This has a whole different style of blade here. Pretty obvious. We still have the hole for the wire cutter, but we have a spear point versus more of a clip style or hooked style. We still have the serrated edge, but this is smooth. This has kind of this unique step, not only on this side, but also on the transverse side here. That's just a unique way of doing a blade. And also it has a new finish. Now this one, this is a refurbished bayonet, so it's got the darkened, the blackened finish. This is more of a matte finish. They also totally redid the grip. Originally with the AKM, they had a single piece polymer grip, plastic grip. Then they went to the two piece with the steel hilt. Now we're back to a single piece, all plastic style. There's a indentation behind the takedown button for easier grasping. In fact, this whole thing's a little bit longer back here. We no longer have the retention strap or even a spot for it, not even the hook. Instead, we have checkering, and we have finger grooves, ridges, for a better grip. And that plus the longer hilt, it's just an easier grasp. So it's an all-around reworked bayonet. The Scabbard really is very similar, still using a leather or faux leather hanger. And yeah, it would have been for guns like this SGL-31, AK74Ms in Russia. And the production of these is really easy to outline. They were introduced in Russia in the late 80s, early 90s. Right when they were getting away from the polymer materials. There we go. And going to the true black furniture. And they were carried over to Bulgaria. This one's a Bulgarian blade with the Circle 10 on it. But Bulgaria was the only country to manufacture this outside of Russia, and Bulgaria would ship it with a lot of its AR-M1s, AR-M9s. And even though this has been in service for a good 30 years, give or take now, it's still what Bulgaria has. By the way, the button is no longer checkered, it's smooth. And this is what Russia still predominantly uses. I'm not saying there aren't some more fancy 21st century bayonets for special forces and whatnot, but this is still very much the standard. There are a few variations in hanger. For example, there's an export model with more of a canvas hanger, full size, but yeah, it's kind of the progression. Once they hit the AKM pattern, it doesn't change much, especially until you get to this one. This one at least does have a different blade. And in some ways, this blade does kind of remind me of the original AK47. So what do you think? It's kind of a rounding up of my AK bayonets. So let's end with kind of the major generations laid out from the original AK47 to the Type 1 first introduced for the AKM, to the transitional, to the Type 2 AKM / AK74, and of course the one we just talked about, the AK74M 100 series or AR M9 type. It's quite interesting. I went and kind of looked about production and what have you. The original stiletto type was, of course, made by Russia and China before they went to the spiker. It was also made by Poland, as we saw. East Germany made some, although I don't know how many. Bulgaria made some because they were a major user of the AK-47. Actually, they stuck to the AK-47, not even adopting the AKM. And you have a few other outliers like North Korea, and some made for commercial purposes. And it seems like it's debated if Romania actually made theirs or if they maybe perhaps just refurbished. Either way, it kind of gives you the notion of who did them. Things get much more complicated when we get to the AKMs, though. Again, of course, Russia would make this. Romania certainly would, because this is a Romanian with the single piece bulbous grip. They would also be made by East Germany, and Poland would do some. And they weren't as heavily produced as you might think. Hungary would do some. Interestingly, China would not, nor would Bulgaria. But, to be fair, they were only in production about 5 years before we slide into the transitionals. For this type, with the two-piece square metal hilt grip, bayonet, and metal scabbard, these were done by Poland, as we saw, and Egypt, and Romania. Interestingly, the reverse with the newer synthetic scabbard and the old bayonet, that was by Russia and East Germany. So a little bit of a different notion of transition there. One used one type, one used another. And for these, we're kind of having some countries doing it one way, some doing it another. But we kind of unify back up here. With the full second pattern AKM, synthetic scabbard, and revised grip. Of course, these are again built in Russia. Now China is building these again, especially for export model rifles. And Yugoslavia joins the mix here. As far as I know, Yugoslavia didn't make them before, but I could be wrong. Then again, Yugoslavia didn't begin full AK production until 1970 anyway. Hungary would make some. Poland, I don't believe, did. Kind of interesting. And then, of course, we move to our final one we just looked at. Like I said, these were only made in Russia and Bulgaria. And as far as I know, they're still manufactured to this day. Although it could just be that we're using a bunch of old stock. They mass-produced in the communist era, that's for sure. See what I mean about the earliest one and the most recent one being a little more similar than the AKM, AK74? This was definitely more of a utility knife that was a secondary bayonet, which is not a bad thing. And this was definitely much more of a bayonet than anything else. This is still very much a utility, multi-purpose, but maybe a little bit more angling towards being a fighting knife / bayonet than previous just different design changes. Like I said, this was just, these were out and available, and I thought at first to do a short little video, but then, as always happens with me, I get interested in the subject and things start to snowball, and there you have it. But what makes bayonets a little challenging for me is a lot has to do with markings and colorations of grips, things that I am not especially well suited to judge. So when I got things wrong, sorry about that. Did what I could. Either way, hope you enjoyed the video. And we're coming to the end of vacation time, so regular range videos should be resuming quite soon. In the meantime, if you could, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you'd like to help support the channel, please check out the link to the Patreon page. This is Misha. Catch you very soon next time.